Hi, everyone. Welcome to Show Me the Money. I'm Jon Mechanic.
And I'm Sam Coppola.
We're both entertainment attorneys here in Montreal, Quebec. Show Me the Money is all about trying to answer some of the questions that we get asked all the time as entertainment attorneys.
We're going to take you through all of the steps of film financing that we have experience on, from development to your screen story, to financing that script and getting that film financed, producing it and distributing it, all the way from the story itself all into the screen.
And on top of that, we're also going to try to have a bit of fun. Because let's face it, the entertainment industry, the film industry, is all about fun and passion. And speaking of fun and passion, here's Sam with a bottle of wine right now.
What we have is a bottle of red wine Marquette. This is a Pinot Noir a hybrid grape that is produced by us. This one is aged 18 months in oak. And we would be able to just share this, I guess. Here we go.
I'm going to fling this over your way.
Yeah. So I guess the other aspect of wine making and the component of filmmaking combines, I guess, my namesake, Coppola, that both has done film and gone into the wine industry. So it's probably one of the reasons that attracted me to it, because of these aspects to it, that there are Italians who are great filmmakers, Italians who are great winemakers, and also, I guess, Italians who are great lawyers in this industry. And we've joined with the Jewish community as lawyers in the film industry also.
Well, as I've told you, what's interesting is my mother's name is Coppola, which is...
it's true.
Yeah, which is basically the exact same word. In Russian, I think, Coppola refers to the spires on top of churches. What does Coppola mean in Italian? It's hat, right?
It's a hat.
Yeah,
it actually means a hat, yeah.
Exactly. All right, so why don't we have
start off this series with a little bit of vino.
Wonderful.
Here, cheers.
L'chaim.
Salud.
All right, so why don't we get into the more serious stuff, which is the real substance of our podcast. Sam, do you want to maybe provide us with a breakdown of what we're going to go over
I think
in the next bunch of episodes?
It's really going to take you to a journey. Really starting from the beginning. That's why one of the things we call it is Film Financing 101, if you want to refer to it, and Show Me the Money, is because as an independent filmmaker, what you're doing all the time is essentially trying to find money. You have a film and you need to make that film, and you have to get the money to make that film. And the process really begins right at the beginning, when you have a film starts with somebody who has an idea, and they have to either write that script or acquire that script. There's a creation of the first project. So we call that the chain of title. From that aspect of the chain of title, once you actually have control of it, you have to finance it and then get that money, which, develop it and continue going forward. From there, from the financing stage of it, once you actually finance it, then you have to produce it. So, and then the production part is a huge component of it, because there's an enormous amount of time and money spent in a short period of it. And then after the financing of it or production of it, you actually have to get it on screen somewhere, or you have to get it transmitted somewhere or shown somewhere, which is the exploitation of it and the distribution and so forth of it. So those are pretty much the large lines of it. From that component, financing is then broken down into different places of you're going to be able to get that financing. Where are you going to do the picture? What is it that's going to end up financing this aspect of it? So those are all the other then subcomponents that come in that are involved on that side.
And I will add that there's another great simile between the wine and the filmmaking industry, especially growing wine in Vermont, right? Very difficult to do, but once you do it, it's awesome, right? So yeah, do we want to delve into the substance? I know we first wanted to talk mostly about rights, chain of title, but also before that, just start off with what is a film and the history of why are we producing films in Canada? How did that happen? We're not in Hollywood. So shall we?
Yeah. Sure.
Awesome. So why don't we talk about what a movie is, right? Because one of the things that I find interesting as an attorney is we very often, as attorneys, think in black and white, right? We think in terms of what the law says. So what is a film? If I'm a lawyer, what is a film to me? Copyright, right? But if I'm a writer, a film is my brainchild. It's my baby. If I'm a director, similar impression. If I'm an actor, it's the medium by which I convey emotion on screen. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, from my side, usually when they get to the lawyer stage, okay, the film is not that creative component. The film happens to be more like a deal. It happens to be a whole set of circumstances, okay, where you're taking a concept, an idea, a script itself, and then having to adapt that onto a screen. And the aspect of the creative component that we get involved in is that journey from the idea to the time you see it on screen is very, very lengthy. And sometimes it's very confusing because it's not just taking an iPhone or taking a camera and then shooting something and posting it on YouTube or posting it out. An entire film itself is storytelling, but intertwined with all of that is that every single person who works on a film has rights. So from the person who created that film to the person who actually ends up showing that film on a large screen or on a TV or on a computer screen itself, all that process requires rights, requires that each person that has participated in it has actually signed a contract with you and has gone through that whole process of actually bringing it together to a producer, to one person who gathers all of that.
Right. And as I'm sure anyone who's watched the end credits, the end crawl of a film who's seen, takes a village. So there's a lot of rights in there, right? And there's a lot of different kinds of rights.
And most people don't watch those. The people who are in the film industry actually watch the credits. If you're at a film and you go to a film and people are staying behind and they're reading those screen credits, they're probably involved somehow in the film or in the film industry.
Yeah, I agree. You stay behind, right? Yeah, I stay behind too.
I wait for the section where it says who's the lawyer on the film because we get that recognition on the film.
Well, one of the interesting things that you see is, especially in animated movies, very often you see an entire host of French names pop up in the VFX section, which typically means either that there were animators out of Montreal or out of Paris working on the film. And sometimes I'll watch an animated film without knowing that there was a Montreal connection. And then it's a nice surprise at the end.
Until you see some of the background sometime.
Yeah, exactly.
There's so many movies that are made today that people don't even know where they were made, and many of them made in Canada. I'll just give you one example. I think it was produced in Canada or something. Here, foreign productions shot in Quebec. Look at number 20. This is coming from our agency that takes care of relationships for film, called the QFTC, the Quebec Film and Television Commission. X-Men, Dark Phoenix, Pet Cemetery, the Hummingbird Project, which we worked on our side. Long Shot, Good Sam, a Netflix film. On the Basis of Sex was made here by Participant Media. I mean, the list just goes on and on. Murder Mystery with Adam Sandler and Jennifer Aniston. Playmobil, which is an animated film. All of these films were made in Montreal, essentially in Quebec, and so forth. Many of them not even telling you in any way that they are being made here.
So I think that's a really, really good segue into what are we doing here? How cold is it outside right now?
Well, I don't have the temperature, but I think it was minus 13 degrees.
I walked outside yesterday for 2 blocks with gloves, a hat, and my insanely warm parka, and it was a trek.
Mhm.
So what are we doing here, right? I mean, we all think of Hollywood as the center of film, right? Before that, it was actually New York, Jacksonville, Florida. If you look at
Was it? Yeah.
history, was actually in the running for a little while.
Mhm.
And then in the late 19 teens and early 20s, people moved up. They packed up and moved to Hollywood, and that became the center of the American film industry. So what are we doing in Canada? It seems like the last place, right?
Well, there were a lot of Canadian films that have been made for many, many years. If you just think back, I mean, what is it over here? If we go to the top 200 Canadian films, the first film that I have here is called Hiawatha in 1903. And then there's Evangeline in 1914. What did you tell me? Was it about Evangeline?
Cymbeline or I think it's Cymbeline. Or is it Evangeline? It's
Evangeline.
Evangeline
Yeah.
is actually a dead film. So there is a photo available,
Yeah.
but there is no existing copy that's been dug up. So for all purposes, it's a dead film. But the one that I
So
actually...
we started making film at the turn of the century, Canada.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What I actually like, the one before that you found was 2 years in Manitoba or 10 years in Manitoba?
10 years in Manitoba. Hold on. That was another
Let's
picture.
pull that up.
Hold on. Let me just see that one. 10 years in Manitoba.
And I think, so the premise behind that film was, as far as I understand, it was to incentivize people to move out to the prairies and out west, right? You had this entire expansive continent, both in Canada and the US. The legislatures were passing things called Homestead Acts.
Oh, it was
which-
released in 1898.
1898.
Wow.
So there were these Homestead Acts passed at the time, right? And they said, ostensibly, what these Homestead Acts did was they said, if you move out to the prairies or out to the west, to the frontier, we're just going to give you land. And if you're a couple moving out, we're going to give you even more land. So this film is 10 years in Manitoba. This was an expose, I think, on...
There it is on IMDb. But it doesn't have any, it doesn't really have much of an IMDb spec or information. Like you said, this was a politically motivated film. Canadian documentary directed by James Freer. That's it.
Exactly. So this has always been a part of our heritage, right? And it's in our DNA as Canadians. One of the things that I find very interesting always is the disproportionately large number of filmmakers, entertainers, singers in the entertainment industry living in LA, right? So the LA entertainment industry pulls heavily on Canadian talent, and I would say disproportionately so.
Well, for the size of our population, we've
Exactly.
had quite a bit of...
We're 1/10. We're less than 1/10 of the population of the U.S. So early history of filmmaking, where do we go after that? The next thing that I really saw that is interesting is the foundation of the National Film Board in 1939. And the next point after that,
Well, if you
want to pull
look
something
at
up,
the directors, if you do Canadian directors, right? They seem to jump because, like you said, in 1939, with the start of the National Film Board, you're looking at people like not Ivan Reitman, Alan King, 1930, Claude Jutras, one of our first Canadian directors, Quebec directors, and an actor himself. That's 1930. Arthur Miller, 1923. These people were probably, like you said, started because of the fact that Canada needed an identity. One of the identities is film. In fact, in film, it's a culture. It's a story, right? And what you're doing in film is you're making moving pictures, right? That when you said, what is a film in Canada is a cinematographic work under the Copyright Act, okay? In the United States, it's a moving picture because technically it's a series of still film pictures that are run together, which make it appear that a person is moving, the moving picture. component of it. So it's another way to tell stories, and stories and books are about culture. And if you look at it, then that culture is defining a population. So Canada, to me, and especially Quebec, which is very strong and holds itself very dear to its own culture, would be focusing on trying to make films about its culture and protect that aspect of it. That would probably explain the National Film Board, so we can conserve our culture. It explains some of the tax incentives and all the measures and policies that are there to protect our industry. In fact, there's so many things about that protect our industry. To distribute a film in Canada, you have to be a Canadian distributor, unless you were grandfathered under certain legislation. To distribute films in Quebec, it has to be distributed by a Quebec-owned company.
Well, exactly. Tax legislation is always the situs of tremendous policy-making decisions, and tax legislation and regulations relating to the film industry and the TV industry are no exception to that. They're laden with value judgments. I think on my way to AFM this year, I was reading Barney's version by Mordecai Richler, and I shared that amazing quote with you, where Barney talks about how he used to lobby the government with respect to tax incentives. And one of the things that he was saying was, we are defining our culture as Canadians. And it's a big part of what filmmaking is in Canada, in my view. So we have...
And Barney's version became a film.
A film produced by Robert Lantos. Yeah. And I think it was Richler's last book and probably his magnum opus. And Barney in that played a film producer based in Montreal. So it's always been really interesting for me, that story. So we have the National Film Board. And then why don't we talk about these tax shelter films, which were before my time. They started in 1974, but I've always found them really, really interesting.
Well, I became a lawyer in 1983. And in 83, you had the tax credit system, a shelter system, a tax deduction, where the investors would come in and they'd be buying 1/100th or 1/200th of a film. And you'd have to gather 200 investors, doctors, lawyers, and business people, and so forth. And each one of them would put in a certain amount of money. And they would be able, if they owned that film, to write off 100% of their investment. So that the tax department was literally their partner. And this would reduce the risk of creating a film in Canada. And by doing that, what you ended up creating was a situation where the film was being made more like a tax structure deal than it was necessarily focusing on the content of it, right? So, and to actually get your tax deduction, you had to invest by the year end so that you would get your deduction in the upcoming April, right? So one of the first deals that I worked on as a lawyer, was on December 31, New Year's Eve, and we were closing the film financing where the brokers were bringing in the money and the contracts with the subscriptions of these investors. And the film producer was signing the documents, because the year end was when you had to have all of your stuff together so that the people who invested in it would take the deduction for the following April for that year. So your film was actually closing on New Year's Eve, which was basically where we were passing our time as lawyers in this industry for that period of time at that time.
I've had worse New Year's Eves, just for the record.
Right, okay.
So, all
You're
good.
right. We were together with a lot of other people, and then once it had closed, we could actually open up a champagne or a wine bottle or something and say, yes, we've done it.
Exactly. So when I was reading up on these, I couldn't help but laugh, because there's this incredibly hilarious notion we are making movies without regard for their creative quality. We're going to try to make them good, but it's not really our priority. But the the unintended consequence of that, which is a very, very good thing for the Canadian film industry, is that we had below the line people, creators, various personnel in the film industry getting boots on the ground, training. And that, for me, it's something I'd like to study more in detail. It seems like it really is kind of the beginning of putting together a bona fide, high quality industry here with very well trained people, which is what we're known for today.
It resulted in the creation of an industry. Absolutely.
Exactly.
Absolutely. And that industry varies because, like you said, you've got high quality technicians, but not only high quality technicians. I mean, you've created amazing talent. I mean, today's top directors, I'm going back now to these directors here, right? If you look at it, David Cronenberg, Denis Villeneuve, James Cameron. James Cameron is a Canadian director. He probably has directed maybe the most successful films, okay, in history, okay? And he's Canadian. And he comes out of the system which was there at the time when there was tax shelters and tax investors and tax credits. And he, I guess, now lives in Hollywood, right? And so has been seduced by the Hollywood. He is also, I don't know if some of you know it, he's the director of the Terminator.
T1.
T1 and T2,
was
yeah.
Great.
And Alien.
Yeah.
And Titanic. So is that a Canadian film, by the way?
Well, I was just going to say that really hits the right point, right? Which is, and I mentioned this before, there are so many Canadians in this industry, right? So are we defining Canadian films or Canadian content in the right way? We're definitely defining it in one way, but it's somewhat limiting, right? So like, I don't think Terminator 1 is a Canadian film, even though the auteur behind Terminator 1 is a Canadian. And there are so many examples of that. This Is the End, hilarious movie from 2013 or 2014, features Seth Rogen and Jay Baruchel.
Right.
Seth Rogen from Vancouver, Jay Baruchel from Montreal. They're playing themselves in LA. Is that a Canadian film?
Well, who wrote the film? This is the End, 2013. Okay. So it says that the director is Evan Goldberg and Seth Rogen.
Evan Goldberg went to McGill, right?
So Evan Goldberg is a Canadian director. Seth Rogen is a Canadian Canadian, right? The writer is Seth Rogen and also Evan Goldberg, right? And what it says, there's 5 more credits for writing. Who are these people?
Jason Stone, who created a short called Jay and Seth versus the Apocalypse, also Canadian.
Also Canadian.
That's what the feature was based on.
Okay, so hold on. So now we have directed by Canadians, written by Canadians, and who stars in it? James Franco, it says, Seth Rogen, Jay Baruchel. So Seth is Canadian. Jay Baruchel is Canadian. Okay? I don't know. There's probably a few other Canadians in here.
Michael Cera, Canadian.
Michael Cera, okay. Michael
Brampton,
Cera.
Ontario.
Yeah.
So I think the point that we're getting at is that...
So to you or to me, is this a Canadian film? Is This Is the End is a Canadian film? I don't know. What they are defining Canadian films in Canada as is films that actually meet what is called a test. That test is based on who owns the film, the producer of the film, right? So if this is done by a Hollywood company, it wouldn't be a Canadian film. Even though we now have shown that you have a Canadian director who, the director is responsible for what you see on screen, right? So the person who has the most creative effect on what you see on screen is the director. The second person who has that direct effect of what you see on screen and the story, who writes the story, is the writer. So the story is Canadian, written by a Canadian. The person who has put it on screen is Canadian. But because it was produced by a company who has a head office in Los Angeles or somewhere else, okay, our government doesn't think this is a Canadian film. I think it's a Canadian film.
Well, and just without having analyzed this in great depth, I think this passes the points test, right?
Well, it does in the sense that you would have yourself. So the Canadian system, again, if you're looking at trying to get money, tax credits out of it, you have to have 6 out of 10 points. Okay, 2 points are given for the writer, 2 points are given for the director. So you're already at 4 points. Then
And
your
first or second
your first
lead.
and second star give you another 2 points, right?
So you're at 8 points already.
You're already
there.
at 6 points. So you've technically met the point test of this film to be a Canadian film. Wait, we have one other issue, right? We said we had 2 issues. One, it wasn't produced by a Canadian. Did they do it? Did they produce this in Canada? Did they shoot it in Canada?
I don't know.
No. So then it wouldn't be a Canadian film. So look at that. Mathematically, okay, we missed at one point maybe somewhere else, and we're not a Canadian film. Yet, when you think of a film as being a story, of an audio-visual story, this is a Canadian film.
Exactly. The point is you have all these Canadians out there contributing to the zeitgeist, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's a very, very important thing to realize.
Well, you see, now we're seeing what's happening is that there is the creative aspect of filmmaking, and then there is the political aspect of filmmaking. And if you're asking somebody, the government, to put money up, right? Because that's what the government does through fiscal policy, right? Is it says, I want to promote an industry, and I have to have some tests to govern that industry before I give it money. It has to draw a line somewhere. It's drawing that line through parameters, okay? One of those parameters is who owns the film, which is where we start when we deal with what we call chain of title. Because the film itself has to be owned by somebody and the copyright to it. And when you look at it, copyright is usually owned in many of these films, okay, by Hollywood studios. They're the ones that you know, started it, and the center, like you said, is of film industry.
Now that's a great segue, right? Because where does a film start, right? It starts with chain of title. Chain of title is something that you and I talk about all the time. Thanks so much for listening, everyone, and stay tuned.
Right.